The jagged rocks of the Norse coastline have witnessed countless sacrifices to appease the vengeful sea god. Tonight, they bear witness to something different. As the tide rises against the shore, a young woman stands bound in iron chains, her fate sealed by ancient superstition and tribal fear. The salt-laden wind whips her hair as storm clouds gather, bringing with them the promise of both destruction and deliverance. Through the tempest's fury emerges an unlikely savior, a berserker warrior, once feared for his battle rage, now cast aside by his own people. In a single act of defiance, he shatters her chains and offers himself to the sea god's wrath instead. Yet this is more than a tale of sacrifice. It's a story of redemption, of finding honor in disgrace, and of love kindled in the crucible of survival. What drives a feared warrior to trade his freedom for a stranger's life? Before we jump back, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Astrid's fingers trace the worn carvings on her grandmother's loom as the old woman worked, the steady rhythm of the shuttle matching the distant thunder. Beyond their wooden walls, the village of Stormskeep clung to the rocky coastline like a barnacle to a ship's hull, weathering another season of relentless gales. The air hung heavy with salt and portent, carrying whispers of the council's gathering in the great hall. "They say the fishing boats returned empty again," her grandmother murmured, her gnarled hands never pausing in their work. The elaborate tapestry beneath her fingers depicted the village's founding legend, the ancient pact with the sea god who demanded tribute for calm waters and full nets. "Third time this moon." Astrid pulled her shawl tighter, watching shadows dance across the wall as lightning illuminated the fjord. Through the window, she could see Elder Halfdan making his way toward the great hall, his ceremonial staff tapping against the stone path with each determined step. The runes carved into the ancient oak seemed to pulse with a dull light, though perhaps it was merely a trick of the storm. "The old ways demand balance," her grandmother continued, voice heavy, "with unspoken meaning. When the sea grows hungry, it must be fed." The words sent a chill down Astrid's spine that had nothing to do with the draught seeping through the walls. She had grown up hearing tales of the sacrifices, young women chosen by lot to appease the sea god's wrath. The practice had fallen into disuse during her lifetime, but the chains still hung from the ritual rocks, a constant reminder of the price their ancestors had paid for prosperity. From her position by the window, Astrid could just make out the solitary figure of the village's most feared resident, the berserker who lived in exile at the edge of the settlement. Even at this distance, his massive frame was unmistakable. As he worked at his forge, hammer rising and falling in defiance of the growing storm. Some said he hadn't spoken a word in 5 winters, not since the raid that had earned him both glory and shame. Others whispered that the gods themselves had stolen his voice as punishment for his bloodlust. The smithy's glow cast his shadow against the cliff face, transforming it into something ancient and terrible. Yet there was a grace to his movements that belied his fearsome reputation. Astrid had watched him often enough from afar, curious about the gentle way he handled injured animals brought to his forge. How he left parcels of mended tools outside villagers' doors under cover of darkness. A particularly loud crack of thunder made her start, drawing her attention back to her grandmother's knowing gaze. "The council will make their decision tonight," the old woman said, her fingers finally stilling on the loom. "The storms grow worse, and the villagers grow hungry. They will look to the old ways for answers." The weight of unspoken possibilities settled between them like a physical thing. Astrid was of age, unmarried, and without the protection of a father's name. Her mother had died in childbirth, and her father had been lost at sea before she could walk. Only her grandmother's skill at the loom had kept them fed these past 17 winters. "Perhaps," Astrid suggested, trying to keep her voice steady, "the sea god's appetite has changed. Perhaps he hungers for something other than maiden's blood." Her grandmother's laugh held no mirth. "The gods rarely change their tastes, child. It is we who must bend to their will or break against it. She rose slowly, joints creaking like old timber, and made her way to the chest in the corner. From its depths, she withdrew a bundle wrapped in faded linen. "Your mother wore this," she said softly, unfolding the fabric to reveal a simple white dress, its hem stained with salt spray. When they drew lots for the sacrifice in her youth, it was her closest friend who was chosen. She never spoke of that day, but she kept this as a reminder. Astrid's fingers trembled as they brushed the rough fabric. "Why show me this now?" "Because, my dear one, there are storms coming that no amount of weaving can shelter us from, and when they break upon our shores, you must be ready to face them with the strength of your blood." Her grandmother's eyes held both love and sorrow. "Your mother understood the price of survival in this place. So must you." Beyond their walls, the council members continued to gather, their shadows moving through the storm like figures from the old legends. The Berserker's hammer had fallen silent, but his forge still glowed like a defiant eye against the gathering dark. And somewhere out in the thundering waves, an ancient hunger stirred, demanding to be fed. In the great hall, Elder Halfdan's staff would soon strike the stone floor, calling for silence. The lots would be drawn, the names read, and the wheel of sacrifice would turn once more. But for now, Astrid stood at the window, watching the storm approach, feeling the weight of her mother's dress in her hands, and wondering if the gods truly never changed their tastes, or if perhaps they had simply been waiting all these years, and for the right offering to make them reconsider their ancient appetite. The broken bear totem lay heavy in Bjorn's calloused hands, its fractured surface catching the forge's light like old bloodstains. 5 winters had passed since he'd shattered it against the rocks, yet still he kept the pieces, a reminder of the man he'd been and the beast he'd become. The carved wooden fragments told a story of glory turned to ash, of a warrior's pride. Broken by his own fury, thunder rolled across the fjord as he placed the totem fragments back in their worn leather pouch. The storm's voice spoke to something primitive in his chest, an echo of the battle rage he'd spent half a decade trying to silence. His fingers moved unconsciously to the scar beneath his beard, where an enemy's blade had nearly taken his voice long before he'd chosen to surrender it. The villagers thought his silence was a curse from the gods, a punishment for the lives his berserker fury had claimed. Let them believe it. The truth was both simpler and more complex. He had forfeited his voice the day he'd led 6 warriors to their deaths, their blood mixing with enemy corpses in a raid gone wrong. His battle cry had driven them forward, his rage inspiring their own, until they were too deep in enemy territory to retreat. When the slaughter was done, he alone remained, standing among the dead, friend and foe alike, mangled beyond recognition by his own hands. The hammer's rhythm helped quiet such memories, beating them back like waves against the shore. Iron sang beneath his strikes, transforming from crude metal into tools that would feed the village that shunned him. Each blade and plowshare was an offering, a wordless apology to the community that both feared and needed him. Movement at the widow woman's house caught his eye. The granddaughter again, watching him work as she often did when she thought herself unseen. Astrid, they called her in the marketplace, though none spoke to him directly. He'd noticed her quiet strength, so different from the fear or hostile curiosity others showed. She reminded him of his sister, long ago in another life, before the bear's blood had awakened in his veins. The thought drew his gaze to the sheltered corner of his forge, where a half-finished blade lay cooling. It was too delicate for farming, too refined for hunting. A woman's knife, sized for smaller hands. He'd begun crafting it after seeing Astrid struggling with her grandmother's crude kitchen blade, though he had no way to give it to her that wouldn't spark gossip and suspicion. A commotion from the village centre interrupted his work. The council was gathering, their torches bobbing through the gale like lost spirits. Even at this distance he could make out Elder Halfdan's staff, its runes glowing with an inner light that spoke of old magic and older bargains. The sight stirred something in his memory, Tales heard in his youth of sacrifices and storm gods, of maidens chained to rocks as offerings to the sea. Surely they wouldn't revive those barbaric traditions. Yet the empty fishing boats and lean faces in the marketplace told their own story. Hunger had a way of making even the most civilized people reach for ancient solutions. His hands found the broken totem again, fingers tracing the bear's snarling visage. He remembered the day he'd received it, when the old warriors had recognized the battle fury in him and welcomed him into their ranks. The bear spirit was a gift, they'd said, a weapon to be treasured. None had warned him how it would consume everything he loved, leaving only silence and regret. The wind carried fragments of conversation from the great hall, raised voices, arguing about tradition and necessity. He saw Astrid's grandmother hurrying through the storm, clutching something white in her arms. The sight made his chest tighten with an emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Perhaps that was why he kept the broken totem close, not as a reminder of his shame, but as proof that even the most sacred things could be broken when they demanded too high a price. His fingers closed around the fragments, feeling the sharp edges that had once drawn blood. He had turned his back on the bear's path, chosen silence over slaughter, but as the council's voices rose and fell like the tide, he wondered if there wasn't something worth fighting for after all. The storm intensified, driving rain against his forge's walls like thrown spears. Yet beneath its fury, he caught the sound of quiet weeping from the direction of the widow's house. His hammer paused mid-strike, the unfinished knife gleaming in the forge's light like a question that demanded an answer. 5 years of silence stretched behind him like a road through darkness. Ahead, storm clouds gathered over the ritual rocks where ancient chains still hung waiting to be filled. And in between stood a choice: remain the broken man the village needed him to be, or become something else entirely, something neither berserker nor hermit, but perhaps something worthy of the quiet strength he saw in Astrid's watching eyes. The great hall's ancient stones seemed to breathe in the torchlight, exhaling memories of countless gatherings like this one. At its center stood the sacrifice stone, its weathered surface bearing the names of every woman who had ever been offered to the sea. Astrid's eyes traced the worn runes, each one carved deeper than the last, as if the weight of remembrance could anchor their spirits to this world. Elder Halfdan raised his staff, and the murmuring crowd fell silent. Behind him, council members arranged 13 carved lots on a cloth of midnight blue, one for each eligible maiden in Storm's Keep. The wood was pale as bone, each piece cut from the same lightning-struck ash tree that had provided lots for generations of sacrifices. "We gather," Halfdan's voice resonated against the stone walls, "as our ancestors gathered before us in times of need and darkness. The sea god's hunger grows with each passing storm, and our children's bellies grow empty with each failed harvest." His gnarled fingers traced the names on the sacred stone. Our forebears knew the price of survival in this harsh land. They paid it without hesitation, and the waters blessed them with abundance. Astrid felt her grandmother's hand tighten around hers. In the flickering light, faces she'd known since childhood looked strange and ancient, transformed by fear and desperate faith into something both familiar and foreign. Near the back of the hall, she caught a glimpse of movement, the berserker's massive frame filling the doorway, though he made no move to enter. Their eyes met briefly across the crowded space, and she saw something flash across his features before he melted back into the shadows. "The lots will be drawn by the youngest member of the council," Halfdan continued, gesturing to Leta, a girl barely older than Astrid herself. "She who draws the marked lot shall be prepared at dawn and offered at high tide when the storm reaches its peak." Leta stepped forward, her young face solemn with the weight of her duty. One by one she lifted the lots, displaying each to the gathered crowd before placing them in a bronze bowl that had once been used for mixing healing herbs. The irony of its current purpose was not lost on Astrid. Thunder shook the hall as the final lot was added. Leta's hands trembled as she mixed them, the wooden pieces clicking against the bowl's sides like bones in a grave. The sound seemed to grow louder, drowning out even the storm, until Astrid could hear nothing else. "When your name is called," Halfdan instructed, "step forward and draw your lot. Show it to the council before returning to your place. The marked lot bears the rune of the sea god. There can be no mistake, no appeal once it is drawn." Names were called in order of age, beginning with the eldest eligible maiden. One by one, they stepped forward, each drawing a lot with shaking fingers, each showing an unmarked piece of wood to the council, each returning to their place with visible relief. "Astrid Grimsdotter," Halfdan's voice cut through her racing thoughts. The stone floor felt uneven beneath her feet as she approached the bronze bowl. Only 3 lots remained. Her grandmother's grip had left marks on her palm, 5 small crescents from ancient fingernails pressing too hard against soft skin. The lots seemed to whisper against her fingers as she reached into the bowl. The wood was smooth, worn by countless hands before hers. She wrapped her fingers around one, feeling its weight, heavier than she'd expected, as if it carried all the fates of those who had drawn before her. When she withdrew her hand and turned the lot over, the sea god's rune stared up at her like a hungry eye. The mark was darker than the wood around it, as if it had been burned rather than carved. For a moment she thought she could smell salt and seaweed, though she stood far from any window. Silence fell like a physical weight as she displayed the marked lot to the council. Someone, perhaps her grandmother, made a sound like a wounded animal, but Astrid's eyes were drawn to the doorway where the Berserker had stood. Though he was gone now, she could have sworn she heard the sound of a hammer striking anvil, clear and defiant against the storm's fury. "The lot is drawn," Halfdan proclaimed, though his voice held less certainty than before. "Astrid Grimsdotter will be prepared for the offering at dawn. The ceremony will proceed according to the ancient ways." Her grandmother surged forward, voice cracking with age and desperation. "There must be another way. The girl is all I have left. Surely the god would accept a different tribute." "The lots have spoken," one of the council members replied, though he couldn't meet the old woman's eyes. "The tradition must be honored, or we all face the sea god's wrath." Astrid found her voice at last, surprising herself with its steadiness. "How long?" Halfdan blinked. "What? How long do the preparations take? I would like to return home with my grandmother now to make ready in what time remains." The elder seemed taken aback by her composure, but nodded slowly. "You have until first light. The high tide comes with the dawn storm." As they left the great hall, Astrid caught one final glimpse of the sacrifice stone. In the dying torchlight, the carved names seemed to move, like seaweed swaying in dark waters. Soon, her name would join theirs, another memory etched in stone, for future generations to trace with wondering fingers. The storm had intensified during the gathering, yet she could still make out the glow of the Berserker's forge through the driving rain. The steady rhythm of his hammer rose above the winds. Howl, marking time like a heartbeat in the darkness. Each strike seemed to echo the question that burned in her mind. How many names had been carved in that stone before someone dared to ask if there was another way? The ceremonial white dress lay on Astrid's bed like fallen snow, its salt-stained. A reminder of all who had worn it before. Her grandmother's hands shook as she smoothed the fabric, each touch a farewell. Outside, women of the village gathered with traditional offerings. Sprigs of evergreen for courage, amber beads for protection, though both seemed hollow gestures now. "It should have been burned long ago," her grandmother muttered, fingers catching on a patch where the dress had been mended. "After your mother's friend, but we always keep these cursed things, don't we? Pass them down like treasured heirlooms instead of burial shrouds." Astrid sat at her mother's old vanity, watching as another woman braided her hair in the traditional pattern of the sacrifice. The style was meant to keep the hair from tangling in the chains, she'd been told, though no one would meet her eyes when explaining this practicality. In the mirror's clouded surface, she could see the distant glow of the Berserker's forge, still burning despite the late hour. "Tell me about her," Astrid said suddenly. "My mother's friend, the one who wore this dress before, her grandmother's, and stilled on the fabric. Helga, she was barely 17 like you, had a laugh that could charm. Birds from the trees." The old woman's voice grew distant with memory. "The storms that year were terrible, worse than these if you can believe it. When she drew the marked lot, she didn't cry, said she was proud to save the village." "Did she save the village?" The storms calmed, the fish returned. Life went on as it always does. Her grandmother's laugh was bitter. "But at what cost? How many daughters must we feed to the sea before we question the hunger itself?" A knock at the door interrupted them. Elder Halfdan entered, carrying a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. "The final preparations must begin," he announced, though his authoritative tone seemed forced. "The ceremony requires certain traditions to be observed." He unwrapped the bundle, revealing various items needed for the ritual: a copper bowl of sacred water for cleansing, strips of blessed linen for binding the hands, herbs to be burned for purification. Each object carried the weight of centuries of use, polished by the hands of countless sacrifices before her. "You should be honored," one of the village women offered weakly. "The sea god chooses only the worthy." "Does he?" Astrid's voice was quiet but clear. "Or do we simply tell ourselves that to ease the burden of what we do?" The woman stepped back as if struck, but Astrid's attention was drawn to a sudden change. In the rhythm from the distant forge, the Berserker's hammer had taken on a different cadence, faster, more urgent, as if racing against the approaching dawn. Her grandmother shooed the other women out, claiming the right to perform the cleansing ritual herself. Once they were alone, she pressed something into Astrid's hand, a small knife, its blade sharp and new. "Where did you get this?" Astrid whispered, recognizing the craftsmanship. The Berserker's work was unmistakable. "Found it on our doorstep. At dusk. Perhaps even monsters can show mercy." The old woman's eyes were fierce. "Hide it in your dress if the chance comes." But they both knew the chains would be too strong for such a small blade. Still, Astrid tucked it into a fold of the white dress, taking comfort in its weight against her hip. The cleansing ritual began, her grandmother washing her face and hands with the sacred water, murmuring the ancient prayers that were meant to prepare her for the sea god's embrace. The words felt hollow now, like shells emptied of their creatures, retaining only the echo of what they had once contained. Through it all, the sound of the Berserker's hammer continued, a counterpoint to the prayers and storm. Each strike seemed to speak of defiance, of rage contained but not extinguished. Astrid found herself timing her breathing to its rhythm, drawing strength from its steady persistence. "There's something wrong with a god who demands such tribute," her grandmother said finally, setting aside the copper bowl. "In the old tales, the gods tested humanity's wisdom as often as their faith. Perhaps," she paused, choosing her words carefully, "perhaps the test is not in the sacrifice itself, but in our willingness to question it." Astrid touched the hidden knife, feeling its edge through the fabric. "You think the sea god wants us to refuse?" "I think any god worth worshipping would want us to think, to choose, to fight when tradition demands too high a price." The old woman's hands were steady now as she helped Astrid into the white dress. "Your mother understood that at the end. The night Helga was taken, she spoke against it. Not loudly enough, she always said, not strongly enough to make a difference." The dress settled around Astrid like a shroud, the salt-stained hem brushing. Her ankles. In the mirror she looked both ancient and young, a girl wearing the mantle of centuries of sacrifice, yet something new in her eyes that spoke of questions unasked and choices unmade. The Berserker's hammer fell silent at last. In its absence the storm seemed louder, hungrier. Dawn was approaching, painting the eastern sky with colors like bruises. Soon the village would come for her, lead her to the ritual rocks where the chains waited. "Whatever happens," her grandmother said fiercely, pressing something else into her hands, the broken pieces of an old pendant, twinned to one that had been buried with her mother. "Remember that courage takes many forms. Sometimes it roars like a berserker's rage, sometimes it whispers like a question in the dark, but it always, always chooses." Astrid clutched the pendant fragments, feeling their edges press into her palm. Beyond their walls, torches were being lit for the procession. The white dress felt heavy with the weight of all who had worn it before, their combined fate pressing down like chains already. Yet underneath that weight, the berserker's knife rested against her hip, its presence a reminder that even the oldest traditions could be broken by hands strong enough to dare. The procession wound its way through the pre-dawn darkness like a serpent of torchlight. Ancient tide charts, carefully preserved on weathered vellum, had determined the exact moment when the sacrifice must begin. Astrid walked at its center, the white dress glowing ghost-pale in the stormlight, her grandmother's pendant hidden. Beneath its folds, alongside the berserker's knife, the ritual rocks rose before them, black teeth against a grayer sky. Centuries of waves had carved them into shapes that seemed almost deliberate, ancient faces watching with hollow eyes as the procession approached. The chains hung from their highest points, iron links thick as a man's wrist, their surfaces pitted by salt and time, but still strong enough to hold. Elder Halfdan consulted the tide charts one final time, his fingers trembling as they traced. The intricate calculations. The timing must be precise, he muttered more to himself than the gathered crowd. Too early, and the sacrifice is invalid. Too late. He didn't need to finish. Everyone knew what happened when the tide rose too high. The chains rattled in the strengthening wind, their song like old bones clicking together. Astrid fought to keep her steps steady as she approached them, refusing to let fear show on her face. The berserker's forge stood dark and silent now, its absence somehow louder than its presence had been. "The binding must be witnessed," Halfdan announced, his voice carrying over the storm's growing fury. "As it was in the beginning, so must it be now. Who will speak for the sacrifice?" Her grandmother stepped forward, back straight despite her years. "I witness her courage," the old woman declared, the traditional words heavy with personal meaning. "I witness her worth. I witness her choice." That last word seemed to hang in the air like lightning about to strike. Choice. As if there had ever been a choice in this. Yet something in her grandmother's tone made Astrid look closer at the chains before her. Each link bore marks, not just from the sea's assault, but from human hands. Scratches that might have been made by small blades, desperate attempts at freedom that had failed, but left their testimony in iron. The binding ritual began. Halfdan approached with the blessed linen strips, meant to protect her skin from the chain's rough embrace. But as he wrapped her wrists, his movements were uncertain, lacking the confidence of true conviction. "The old ways must be honored," he whispered, though whether to her or himself was unclear. "The god must be appeased." Must he? Astrid's voice was quiet, but carried like a blade through silk. "Or do we simply refuse to imagine another way?" The elder's hands faltered. For a moment, she thought she saw doubt in his eyes. But then the storm surged, sending spray over the rocks, and his expression hardened. "Secure the chains," he commanded. The iron was colder than she'd expected, its weight almost alive against her skin. Each clink of metal on metal echoed with finality as the village men fastened the ancient locks. The tide was rising faster now, urged on by the storm's fury. Already waves were breaking against the lower rocks, sending salt spray high enough to dampen the hem of her dress. Through the growing storm, movement caught her eye, a shadow among shadows, massive and deliberate, moving with the silence of a hunter, the berserker. He kept to the edges of the gathering, but his presence was like a hook in her chest, drawing her attention even as the chains drew tight. "The offering is prepared," Halfdan proclaimed, raising his staff. Now we begin the final prayers, asking the sea god to accept this sacrifice and grant us." A sound cut through his words, stopping them as surely as a blade to the throat. It took Astrid a moment to recognize it as a voice, deep, rough with disuse, yet clear as a storm bell. "No!" The crowd parted like waves before a ship's prow as the berserker stepped forward. His face was terrible in the torchlight, bear's fury warring with human anguish. Each step was deliberate, measured, as if he were fighting some inner battle. With every movement, 5 years of silence, he growled, his voice growing stronger with each word. "Watching you cling to traditions that should have died with the old world. 5 years of crafting your tools, mending your weapons, protecting your borders while you whispered about curses and judgment." His eyes met Astrid's, and in them she saw not the mindless rage of legend, but something deeper, recognition, perhaps of another soul trapped by the weight of ancient expectations. "If the sea god demands blood," the Berserker declared, reaching for the chains with hands that could bend iron, "let him taste a warrior's instead of a maiden's. Let him choke on it." The crowd's collective intake of breath was almost lost in the storm's howl. Halfdan stepped forward, staff raised. The ritual requires a sacrifice." The Berserker's voice rolled like thunder. "It says nothing about the sacrifice being unwilling." Astrid felt the chains shiver, as if responding to the truth in his words. Or perhaps it was her own trembling, born not of fear now, but of a wild, impossible hope. The knife hidden in her dress seemed to burn against her hip, not a weapon of escape any longer, but perhaps something else, a key to a different kind of freedom. The tide rose higher, hungry waves reaching for her feet. In moments, the lower rocks would be submerged. Time was running out for all of them. The village, trapped in its traditions, the Berserker, seeking redemption in sacrifice, and her, standing between ancient ways and new possibilities like a bridge waiting to be crossed. The storm gathered itself for another assault, and in its voice, Astrid heard her grandmother's words echo back to her. Courage takes many forms. Sometimes it roars like a berserker's rage, sometimes it whispers like a question in the dark. But it always chooses. The Berserker's axe caught the torchlight like captured lightning as he drew it from his belt. The weapon was different from the crude tools of war Astrid had seen before. This was a masterwork of his own forging, its edge keen enough to split a storm. Runes traced its surface, not the traditional markings of battle fury, but newer, symbols that spoke of protection and choice. "Stand aside," he commanded, his voice carrying the weight of 5 years' stored words. The crowd retreated further, leaving him alone with Astrid and the chains. Up close, she could see the scars that mapped his face and hands, each one a story of violence survived and violence dealt. Yet his touch was gentle as he examined her bonds. "The blade that breaks these chains," Elder Halfdan warned, "breaks our covenant with the sea god himself. Would you doom us all for the sake of one girl?" The Berserker's laugh was like stones grinding together. "I've seen gods bleed, old man, seen them fall. Your sea god's appetite speaks more of our fear than his power." His eyes met Astrid's. "The knife I gave you, do you have it still?" She nodded, feeling its weight against her hip. Understanding bloomed like dawn through storm clouds. This wasn't a rescue. It was something far more dangerous. A choice. "The sacrifice must be willing," the Berserker continued, loud enough for all to hear. "Must choose to give themselves to the sea. Those are the words of your own ritual, are they not?" Halfdan's face paled. "You dare quote our sacred texts?" "I dare much more than that." The Berserker raised his axe, but not to strike. Instead, he pressed its handle into Astrid's bound hands. "I offer myself in her place, not as your sacrifice, but as my own choice. The question is, will you choose to release her?" The hidden knife seemed to burn against her skin now. A test, she realized, not from the sea god, but from this man, who had forged her a blade of freedom and now offered himself as her replacement. The axe's weight was perfect in her hands, its balance speaking of countless hours of careful crafting. "Your name," she said softly. "Before you do this, tell me your name." Something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, perhaps, that she would ask, or that she would think he had anything left worth naming. "Bjorn," he answered, his voice softening for the first time. "Though some called me Bjorn Bloodfury. Before you chose silence over slaughter," she finished for him, "and now you would choose sacrifice over safety." The storm surged around them, waves crashing higher against the rocks. Time was running out. The crowd watched in tense silence, caught between ancient tradition and this new possibility. Astrid's fingers found the knife's hilt beneath her dress. With her other hand she raised the Berserker's axe, its runes glowing faintly in the darkness. "No," she declared, her voice carrying over the wind. "I choose differently." The axe swung down, not at her chains, but at the rock itself. Sparks flew as ancient stone met master-forged steel. At the same moment, she drew the small knife and began working at the blessed linen bindings that held her wrists. "Stop her!" Halfdan cried, but none moved to obey. They had seen something in her face, something that spoke of a power older than their sea god's hunger. The power of choice itself. The Berserker, Bjorn, watched her with something like wonder as she worked herself free. "The chains are still strong," he warned. "Even my axe will take time to break them." "Then we break them together," she replied, freeing one hand and reaching for the axe's handle alongside his own. "Or we find another way entirely." Their hands met on the weapon's grip, and in that moment the storm's voice changed. What had been a howl of fury became something else, a sound like laughter, like recognition. The waves that reached for them now seemed less hungry than curious. "Look!" Her grandmother's voice cut through the chaos. She pointed to the sea, where the storm clouds were parting just enough to reveal a strange light beneath the waters. Not the sickly glow they had expected from their vengeful god, but something clearer, almost bright. Bjorn's expression shifted as he saw it, recognition flooding his features. "The old tales," he murmured. "They speak of the sea god's testing, of his people, not through their obedience, but through their courage to question," Astrid finished, remembering her grandmother's words. "To choose differently when the old ways demand too much." Together they raised the axe again, its runes blazing now with a light that matched the glow beneath the waves. The blessed bindings fell away completely, leaving only the iron chains. But before they could strike, something extraordinary happened. The chains began to rust, not slowly, as iron does over years of exposure, but rapidly, as if centuries of sea change were happening in moments. The metal crumbled like autumn leaves, falling away from Astrid's wrists in flakes of red-brown that the wind caught and scattered across the waters. When the last chain had fallen, the storm stilled, not to the dead calm that usually followed a sacrifice, but to something alive and waiting. The waves continued to dance around the rocks, but their motion was almost playful now, like a god's. "Laughter. The test was never about the sacrifice," Bjorn said slowly, his voice growing stronger with each word. "It was about the courage to break chains, both iron and tradition." Astrid stepped forward, free of her bonds, the white dress now stained with rust and sea spray. She held out her hand to the Berserker, who had given her not rescue, but choice. "Then what chains will you break now, Bjorn Bloodfury? What silences will you choose to end?" The dawn was breaking over the sea, painting the water in colors no one in the village could remember seeing before. The light caught the runes on his axe, making them dance with possibilities as yet unnamed. And in the space between one wave and the next, a warrior who had chosen silence and a maiden who had chosen defiance stood together on the threshold of a story that was only beginning to be told. Dawn painted the cliffs in shades of amber and blood as Astrid and Bjorn made their way along the hidden paths of the coastline. In his hand, he clutched an ancient map taken from his forge, its parchment worn thin with age, its markings showing secret ways through the coastal maze that even the village elders had forgotten. "The caves were used by my ancestors," Bjorn explained, his voice still rough from years of silence. "Before they settled, before they built their great halls and forgot the old wisdom." His fingers traced the faded lines. "They knew the sea god's true nature then, not as a hungry beast to be appeased, but as a force that rewards those who dare to chart their own course." Behind them, shouts echoed from the village. Not everyone had accepted the morning's revelation. Hilda Halfdan's voice rose above the others, calling for their capture, speaking of sacrilege and divine punishment. The sound carried oddly in the morning air, distorted by fog and stone, until it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "They'll follow the main paths first," Astrid said, her grandmother's pendant bouncing against her chest as they climbed. The white dress was torn now, stained with rust and sea spray, transformed from a symbol of submission into a badge of defiance. Looking for the obvious route inland, Bjorn nodded, studying a fork in the narrow trail. The map showed markings here, symbols that looked like waves but moved differently on the parchment, as if drawn with water instead of ink. "Your grandmother," he said suddenly. "Will she be safe?" The question surprised her, this evidence of thought for others from a man the village had branded a mindless berserker. "They need her weaving too much to harm her," Astrid assured him, though worry gnawed at her heart. "And she has allies in the village." Not everyone believed in the sacrifices. They chose the left path, which seemed to lead straight into the cliff face until a subtle twist revealed a narrow passage through the rock. The walls here bore markings. Not the familiar runes of the village, but older signs that seemed to shift and change when viewed directly. "I watched you, you know," Bjorn said as they navigated the tight space. "These past years, not just at my forge. I saw how you questioned things others took for granted, how you helped those the village would rather forget." "Pooh, and I watched you," Astrid replied, remembering countless days spent observing his solitary work. "The gentle way you handled injured animals, the tools you left for those too proud to ask for help. Some monsters you were." His laugh echoed strangely in the narrow passage, transformed from its earlier stone-grinding harshness into something almost warm. "We see what we're taught to see, until we learn to look with our own eyes." The path opened suddenly onto a broader ledge, revealing a view of the coastline that stole Astrid's breath. From this height, she could see the whole sweep of the village's bay, the ritual rocks now tiny and insignificant against the vastness of the sea. The morning light caught the waves in a way she'd never seen before, creating patterns that seemed almost like writing. "There," Bjorn pointed to a dark opening half hidden by a fall of rock. "The first of the sanctuary caves. We'll be safe there while we decide our next move." He paused, studying her face. "Unless you'd rather make your own way, you're free now." "You don't owe me anything." Astrid touched the knife he'd made her, still tucked in the folds of her dress. "Freedom isn't about being alone," she said softly. "It's about choosing who to walk beside." Before he could respond, a shout from below froze them both. A group of village warriors had spotted them, led by Halfdan's eldest son. They were taking the main path up the cliff, moving faster than expected. "They'll be slowed by the narrow sections," Bjorn assessed, warrior's instinct surfacing. "But we should hurry. The cave entrance is defensible if it comes to that." His hand went to his axe, then stopped. "Though I'd rather not prove them right about my violent nature." Astrid studied the map in his hands, noting a detail he'd missed. "Here," she pointed to a series of markings near their position. "These symbols, they're like the ones my grandmother uses in her weaving when she's showing how threads cross and recross. If I'm reading them right." She moved to the cliff face, running her hands over the rock until she found what she was looking for, a nearly invisible seam in the stone. Pressing there caused a section of the path behind them to shift, sending a cascade of loose rock down the narrow trail they'd just climbed. "Not enough to hurt anyone," she explained, seeing Bjorn's concerned expression, "but enough to slow them considerably." His eyes held a new respect as he studied the blocked path. "You continue to surprise me, Astrid Grimsdottir." "As do you, Bjorn, who chooses his own name," she replied, noting how he'd instinctively moved. "To protect their pursuers from harm, rather than embrace the violence they feared from him." Together, they made their way to the cave entrance, the map showing them handholds invisible to untrained eyes. Inside, the cave opened up into a space that spoke of long use. Old fire pits, storage niches carved into the walls, even faded. Paintings showing scenes of ships and storms, and what might have been conversations with the sea itself. "My ancestors didn't just hide here," Bjorn said, reading the ancient images. "They learned here, waited out storms both natural and human, found new ways forward when the old paths were blocked." Astrid moved to stand beside him, studying the cave art. In the dim light filtering through the entrance, she could almost see the figures moving, telling their stories of survival and change. then perhaps that's what we're meant to do as, well, not just survive, but learn. Find new ways. The shouts from below had grown fainter, the pursuers presumably forced to find another route. In their absence, the cave filled with a different kind of sound. The distant sea's eternal voice, neither threatening nor hungry now, but patient, waiting to see what stories these new occupants would add to the walls of memory. Bjorn unrolled the map fully, revealing sections they hadn't examined before. There are more caves marked here, leading inland to places I've only heard of in stories. Settlements where people found different ways to live with the sea's power, different bargains, to strike with old gods. Then let's find them, Astrid said, the pendant warm against her skin like a promise. After all, isn't that what the sea god really wanted? Not our submission, but our courage to seek new paths. The morning light reached deeper into the cave, illuminating the ancient paintings with the same strange glow they'd seen beneath the waves. And in that light, two figures who had defied tradition began to plan their next steps, adding their own story to the tales written on stone and memory and the ever-changing face of the sea. Deeper in the cave, ancient paintings sprawled across, the walls like frozen dreams. Bjorn's torch revealed layer upon layer of images, not just the expected scenes of sacrifice and storm, but stories that contradicted everything the village had taught about their history with the sea god. Here a woman stood not in chains, but in conversation with a wave-shaped figure. There, a warrior laid down his weapons to accept a gift of wisdom from the waters. These aren't records of submission, Astrid breathed, her fingers tracing a spiral pattern that seemed to move in the flickering light. Their memories of partnership, the old ways weren't about feeding the sea's hunger at all. Bjorn moved the torch closer to a series of interconnected scenes. Look here, the same figures appear multiple times but transformed, not victims, but initiates. His voice held the wonder of a man rediscovering his own lost heritage. My grandfather once spoke of such things before the village elders branded him a heretic and drove him into exile. The painting showed a progression, a figure bound in chains, then breaking free, then standing tall with arms raised to welcome rather than ward off the waves. Each iteration was marked with symbols that resembled the runes on Bjorn's axe: protection, choice, transformation. The sea god never demanded death, Astrid realized, her grandmother's pendant growing warm against her skin as if responding to the discovery. The chains were meant to be broken. The sacrifice was meant to be transformed, not consumed. A sound echoed from the cave's entrance, voices carrying through the stone passages. The pursuit hadn't ended, it had only changed direction. Bjorn extinguished the torch with practiced efficiency, but darkness didn't fall. The cave paintings continued to emit a faint phosphorescence, telling their stories in living light. "There's more here than just history," Bjorn whispered, studying the glowing images. "These paint themselves into being, like the maps changing. Marks, old magic, older than the village's understanding of it." They moved deeper into the cave system, following the trail of illuminated art. The paintings became more detailed, more intimate, showing not just the grand scenes of transformation, but the small moments of discovery that led to them. A warrior learning to calm his battle rage through meditation beside tidal pools. A young woman discovering she could read the sea's messages in the patterns of waves. "It's us," Astrid said suddenly, stopping before a particular scene. "Not exactly, but look." The glowing image showed two figures, one massive and battle-scarred, the other slender but strong, standing before a choice. Behind them, broken chains and discarded traditions. Before them, multiple paths leading to different futures, each marked with its own set of challenges and possibilities. "The caves remember," Bjorn mused, his rough voice gentler now. "Or perhaps they dream forward, as well as backward." He reached out to touch the painted figures, then hesitated. "I tried to save you," he admitted, "but you saved yourself, saved us both, perhaps." Astrid's hand found his, calloused palm against calloused palm. "We saved each other, like these others before us." breaking chains, finding new ways forward. Oh, the pursuit sounds grew closer, but they held their ground, transfixed by the cave's revelations. The painted scenes continued to shift and flow, showing them possibilities they hadn't considered. Paths that led not just away from the village, but towards something new entirely. "Your silence," Astrid said carefully, studying a sequence that showed a warrior laying down his rage like a heavy cloak. "It wasn't just shame that kept you quiet, was it? You were learning, transforming." Bjorn's fingers tightened around hers. "The Berserker's fury. It's like being lost in a storm at sea. I thought silence was the only way to find calm waters. But these images," he gestured to the glowing scenes with his free hand, "they show another way. Not suppression, but transformation. Not silence, but a different kind of voice. A particular painting drew their attention. A circular chamber deep underground, marked with the same spiral pattern Astrid had traced earlier. According to the map, it lay just ahead of them, through a series of narrow passages. "The Heart Cave," Bjorn translated the ancient runes beside the image. "Where those who sought transformation would go to face their truths and emerge changed." His voice held both longing and apprehension. "The village elders spoke of it as a place of judgment, but these paintings tell a different story. They would," Astrid said, understanding flowering in her mind. "They turned everything around, didn't they? Made partnership into submission, transformation into sacrifice, wisdom into fear." She straightened, decision crystallizing. "We should go there, to the Heart Cave. The pursuers are close," Bjorn warned, though she could hear the same determination in his voice. "And the passages leading there are treacherous. More treacherous than chains on the ritual rocks?" She smiled in the phosphorescent light. "Besides, look at the paintings. Every figure who enters the Heart Cave carries something heavy. Rage, fear, shame, and every figure who emerges stands lighter, stronger." As if in response to her words, the cave paintings rippled with new light, illuminating a path deeper into the earth. The pursuit sounds seemed to fade, not because their hunters had given up, but because they were moving into spaces where such mundane concerns held less power. "Together then," Bjorn said, his voice holding the same mixture of trust and challenge she felt in her own heart. "Into the deep places, to see what transformations await us both." They moved forward, following the glowing trail, leaving behind the weight of old stories and stepping into the possibility of writing their own. The cave paintings continued their slow dance of revelation around them, showing scenes of what was, what is, and what might yet be, all flowing together like waves on an endless shore of possibility. The tracking stones hummed in half-dance. Sun's hands, their dark surfaces gleaming with an inner light that pointed the way through the cave system. These ancient tools, passed down through generations of village hunters, were said to find any prey, but they had never been used quite like this before. The stones seemed confused, their glow flickering between different paths, as if uncertain which truth to follow. Meanwhile, Astrid and Bjorn navigated the narrow passages leading to the Heart Cave, their way lit by the strange phosphorescence of the paintings. They moved in harmonious silence, each anticipating the other's steps as if they'd been traveling together for years rather than hours. "The stones will lead them to us eventually," Bjorn murmured, recognizing the distant hum. "They're connected to the old magic, like everything else here." He touched the wall, feeling the living pulse beneath the rock. "But I don't think they'll lead our pursuers where they expect to go." Astrid paused at a junction, studying the glowing marks. "These passages, they're like my grandmother's weaving patterns. The threads don't just cross, they transform each other where they meet." She pointed to a series of intersecting lines. "See how the path changes, depending on who walks it and why." A memory surfaced in Bjorn's mind. His grandfather's voice, sharing forbidden knowledge on the eve of his exile. "The caves know the heart's intent," he quoted softly. "They lead each seeker to the truth they're ready to face." The passage narrowed further, requiring them to turn sideways to proceed. Behind them, the pursuit sounds grew closer, then suddenly distant, then closer again, as if the caves themselves were playing with space and time. They're carrying their fear with them, Astrid observed, hearing the anxiety in their hunters' voices as they echoed through the stone. The tracking stones respond to that fear, showing them what they expect to see rather than what is. She reached for her pendant, then froze. In squeezing through the narrow section, it had caught on, the rock and torn free. The loss hit her harder than expected. It had been her last physical connection to her mother, beyond memory and blood. Bjorn saw her expression and understood immediately. Without a word, he pressed his axe into her hands and began backtracking to the wider section they'd just left. The risk was enormous. Their pursuers were close, and the passage offered no room to swing a weapon if they found him. "Bjorn, don't," she started, but he was already gone, moving with surprising grace for such a large man. Alone in the phosphorescent light, Astrid studied the axe he'd entrusted to her. Its runes seemed to communicate with the cave paintings, creating subtle patterns of resonance that revealed new details in the ancient scenes. She saw stories of other hunters and hunted, of chases that became dances, of pursuit transformed into partnership. The minutes stretched like years until Bjorn returned, something gleaming in his palm, not just her pendant, but something else, a tracking stone, fallen from their pursuers' hands and seemingly drawn to the pendant's location. "They're closer than I thought," he said, returning both items to her, "but they're hunting shadows. The stones show them what their fear tells them to see, a raging berserker, a stolen sacrifice. Not," he gestured between them, "at what they were becoming." Astrid clasped the pendant around her neck once more, then reached for Bjorn's hand. The tracking stone sat between their palmed hands, its hum changing pitch as it responded to their combined touch. Instead of pointing to a prey trail, it now revealed something else, a deeper path, spiraling down toward the heart cave. Everything here is about transformation, she realized. Even the tools of hunting can become tools of finding. They continued their journey, now following the stone's revised guidance. The cave paintings around them seemed to approve, their glow intensifying and revealing new details. They showed scenes of other pairs who had made this journey, hunter and hunted becoming partners in discovery, pursuit becoming pilgrimage. Behind them, the sounds of their pursuers grew more frustrated. The tracking stones they carried were responding to their users' intent, leading them in circles, showing them glimpses of their quarry, only to snatch them away again. The caves were teaching them, in their own way, the futility of their hunt. "Your grandfather," Astrid said suddenly, remembering something. "He wasn't driven into exile at all, was he? He found these caves, learned their truths, and chose to leave." Bjorn nodded slowly. "I was too young to understand then, but he tried to tell me about the true nature of sacrifice, about the difference between surrender and transformation." His voice held old pain and new understanding. "When the battle rage came upon me years later, I remembered his words. Not enough to prevent the tragedy, but enough to choose silence over continued violence, to start the journey of change." The tracking stone grew warmer between them as the passage descended deeper into the earth. Ahead, they could see the entrance to a larger chamber, the heart cave they sought. But reaching it wouldn't be simple. The final approach was a narrow bridge of stone spanning a deep chasm with water flowing far below. "We'll have to cross one at a time," Bjorn assessed. "The bridge doesn't look strong enough to hold both of us together." He studied the gap. "I should go first, test its strength." But Astrid held firm to his hand. "No, together." She held up the tracking stone, which now glowed with the same phosphorescence as the cave paintings. "Look at the walls. Every pair that made it to the heart cave crossed their final threshold together. That's the point. Not safety, but trust." The pursuit sounds had faded entirely now, as if they were in a different world altogether. Perhaps they were. The cave paintings here showed their most complex scenes yet, moments of choice, of trust, of transformation. And at the center of each scene, two figures stepping forward together, neither leading nor following, but moving as one into whatever waited ahead. Bjorn looked at their joined hands, at the axe and pendant and tracking stone that had become tokens of their shared journey. He thought of his grandfather's wisdom, of Astrid's grandmother's weaving patterns, of all the ways old tools could reveal new truths when seen with clear eyes. Together then, he agreed, his voice holding not just trust, but certainty. Whatever waits in the heart cave, whatever transformations it demands, we face it as one. They stepped onto the bridge, their combined weight making the stone sing beneath their feet. Behind them, the cave paintings glowed their brightest yet, illuminating the path they'd taken and the truth they'd discovered, that sometimes the surest way to find yourself is to stop running, stop hunting, and simply walk forward hand in hand into the deep places where change waits to be embraced. Within the heart cave, Astrid and Bjorn discovered the Elder's secret scroll, not displayed prominently as befitted a sacred text, but hidden away in a niche, as if someone had wanted its truths buried. The parchment was ancient, its edges crumbling, yet the ink seemed to shimmer with that same living phosphorescence that illuminated the cave walls. "It's written in the old script," Bjorn said, his voice hushed with reverence. "The same as my grandfather taught me before." He trailed off, fingers hovering over the glowing text. "These aren't just records, they're confessions." Astrid leaned closer, the pendant at her throat pulsing in time with the scroll's illumination. "Can you read it?" "Parts of it. The language is complex, meant to be felt as much as understood." His voice grew stronger as he translated, as if the words themselves were helping him remember how to speak. "We, the first council of Storm's Keep, record here our greatest shame. We did not misunderstand the sea god's will. We deliberately twisted it. The god asked for partnership, for those willing to dive deep into wisdom's waters. But such transformation demanded too much change from those in power. And so we forged chains instead of bridges, turned initiates into sacrifices, made the god's call for growth into a demand for death." The scroll's glow intensified as Astrid touched it, new text appearing beneath her fingers. "There's more," she whispered. "Look, accounts from each generation of elders, adding to the confession." Together, they read the tragic progression, how each council justified maintaining the cruel tradition, how they silenced those who remembered the true ways, how they turned the sea god's temple of transformation into a place of terror. The final entry was in Halfdan's own hand, though it remained unfinished, as if he'd been interrupted or lost the courage to complete his confession. "The storms grow stronger," Bjorn translated the elder's words, "not from the gods' hunger, but from our own fear. We chain our daughters to the rocks because we cannot bear to set them free. We silence those who question because we cannot face our own doubts. And now the sea itself rises against our lies." A tremor ran through the cave, causing loose stones to clatter around them. The scroll's light pulsed urgently, revealing one final section of text, older than all the rest, written in a hand that seemed formed of water itself. "The god's voice comes not in thunder but in truth," Astrid read aloud, the words somehow clear to her, though she'd never learned the ancient script. "The storm's heart holds not fury, but transformation. Break the chains that bind not flesh but thought. Dive deep not into death but understanding." Another tremor shook the chamber, stronger this time. The pursuit sounds had changed, becoming more desperate, not hunting now but fleeing, as the cave system itself seemed to wake around them. "It was never about sacrifice," Bjorn said, understanding dawning in his voice. "The storms come not from the god's wrath, but from the building pressure of truth against lies. Each chain we forged, each silence we enforced, only made that pressure stronger." Astrid's hand found his as the chamber shuddered again. "And now? Now the truth breaks free, like water through stone." He looked at her with new clarity, like a berserker finding his voice, or a sacrifice choosing her own path. The scroll's light had spread to the chamber walls, revealing new paintings emerging from the stone, not ancient scenes, but present moments, their own story taking shape before their eyes. They saw themselves on the ritual rocks, choosing partnership over sacrifice, saw their journey through the caves, fear transforming into trust, saw possibilities branching out before them like rivers, finding new courses to the sea. "Your grandfather," Astrid said suddenly. "He found this scroll." "Didn't he? That's why they branded him heretic and drove him away, because he discovered their lies." Bjorn nodded slowly, "and tried to teach me, though I was too young to understand. When the battle rage came upon me years later, some part of me remembered his words about transformation. That's why I chose silence, not as punishment, but as preparation, waiting for the moment when a new kind of strength would be needed." The tremors were constant now, the cave system groaning like a ship in heavy seas. The scroll's light had become almost blinding, yet neither of them could look away from the truths it revealed. "We have to take this back," Astrid declared. "Show everyone what their traditions really mean. Break not just my chains, but all of them, the ones they've wound around their minds and hearts." "It won't be easy," Bjorn warned. "People cling to familiar chains, even when they hurt. Transformation demands courage, not just in the moment of crisis, but in all the moments that follow. Then we help them find that courage." She touched the scroll gently. "Like these confessions show, each generation had those who knew the truth, who wanted to speak but thought themselves alone. We show them they're not alone anymore." The chamber shook again, and now they could hear something else beneath the tremors. A sound like distant waves, like breathing, like song. The sea god's true voice, not demanding sacrifice, but offering partnership in the endless dance of change. Bjorn carefully rolled the scroll, its light dimming to a steady glow. "The heart cave has shown us the truth. Now we choose what to do with it." His voice held both determination and gentleness. "I spent 5 years in silence, thinking I was containing my rage, but perhaps I was really learning a different kind of strength, the kind needed not for battle, but for transformation. And I spent my life watching others carried to the ritual rocks," Astrid replied, "thinking I was seeing submission to tradition. But I was really learning about courage, the kind needed not for dying, but for living differently." Together they stood in the shifting light of the heart cave, the scroll's revelations illuminating more than just the chamber around them. Behind them lay broken chains and shattered traditions. Before them stretched the harder path of transformation, not just for themselves, but for their entire community. The cave trembled one final time, and in that moment they felt the truth of the sea god's actual demand, not for blood or chains or silence, but for the courage to dive deep into changes, waters and emerge transformed. To break not just the physical bonds, but the chains of thought that kept people bound to cruel traditions. To speak not just with voices, but with the wisdom earned through facing hard truths. And in that moment of understanding, both the Berserker and the sacrifice ceased to be what tradition had named them, becoming instead what they had chosen to be: partners in the work of transformation, carriers of truth, breakers of chains, both seen and unseen. The sea god's horn hung forgotten in the great hall, its ancient bronze surface etched with wave patterns that matched those in the cave paintings. As Astrid and Bjorn emerged from the hidden paths into the pre-dawn light, they could see the horn gleaming through the hall's open doors, waiting like a challenge or an invitation. Their pursuers had returned before them, shaken by their experience in the caves. They huddled in small groups around the village square, jumping at shadows and speaking in whispers about the strange lights they'd seen, the impossible paths that led nowhere, the voices in the stone that spoke of transformation rather than sacrifice. "The horn was never meant to summon the god to witness death," Bjorn said quietly, the scroll secure against his chest. "It was meant to call the community together when truth needed to be spoken." Astrid's grandmother was the first to spot them, her wizened face breaking into a mixture of joy and concern. She hurried forward, her weaving shuttle still in her hands, as if she'd been working through the night to keep fear at bay. "The caves," the old woman said, looking at their faces. "You found what was hidden there." "You knew?" Astrid asked, though it wasn't really a question. Of course her grandmother had known, had woven hints of the truth into her patterns all these years, waiting for someone to learn to read them properly. I suspected. The patterns remember what people forget. She touched the scroll gently. And now you bring the truth home. Others were gathering now, drawn by the sight of their return. Elder Halfdan emerged from the great hall, his face ashen. You've seen it then, he said, his voice heavy with the weight of generations of secrets. The confessions. More than that, Bjorn replied, speaking openly in the village for the first time in 5 years. We've seen what the traditions were meant to be, what they could be again. The horn caught the rising sun, its surface coming alive with patterns that seemed to move like waves. Without discussion, Astrid and Bjorn moved toward it together. The crowd parted before them, sensing that something momentous was about to occur. Wait, Halfdan called, but there was more plea than command in his voice. The old ways, the true old ways, Astrid corrected gently, or the lies we built around them. She lifted the horn from its resting place, feeling its weight, lighter than expected, as if it had been waiting all these years to be used properly again. Bjorn's hands joined hers on the ancient bronze, and together they raised it to the dawn. The note they sounded was neither summoning nor supplication, but awakening. It rang across the water, like a question finally being asked correctly, like a truth rising from depths where it had been too long buried. The sea answered, not with storms or hungry waves, but with a tide of change that rolled in like morning. Light across dark waters. The waves that reached for the ritual rocks now didn't crash but danced, their patterns matching those on the cave walls, on the horn, on the scroll that held generations of hidden truth. Look, Astrid's grandmother called out, pointing to the waters. Look with clear eyes as our ancestors did. In the dawn light, they could all see it, the sea god's true face, not a force of hunger and destruction, but one of constant transformation. Like the caves, like the horn, like the scroll, it had been waiting all these years for people to remember how to see properly. The choice stands before us all now. Bjorn addressed the gathering crowd, his voice carrying the strength of hard-won wisdom rather than battle fury. Not between sacrifice and survival, but between clinging to comfortable lies and diving deep into transforming truth. Astrid unrolled the scroll, letting morning sunlight illuminate its revelations. Each generation faced this choice, she added. Each generation had those who knew better, who wanted to speak. Now we choose again, not just for ourselves, but for all who come after. The horn's note still hung in the air, not fading but changing, becoming something like song, like invitation. And in its truth-telling light, the village stood at its own moment of transformation. Chains of tradition ready to be broken, old lies ready to be washed away, new possibilities ready to be born from the courage to change. The sea god's wave. Patterns danced across bronze and parchment and water, writing and rewriting the story of a people who had lost their way, but might now, finally, find it again. Not through sacrifice, but through partnership. Not through chains, but through choice. Not through fear, but through the courage to dive deep into transformation's waters and emerge changed. The challenge shield lay between them in the great hall, its weathered surface marked with the scars of every trial by combat the village had ever witnessed. But this challenge was different. Bjorn stood before the council not as a berserker seeking battle, but as a truth-bearer, demanding change. By the old laws, the true old laws, he declared, one hand on the shield's rim, I claim the right of challenge, not to shed blood, but to speak truth, not to take life, but to transform it. The shield seemed to respond to his touch, its ancient patterns aligning with those on the horn and scroll that Astrid held. Even the morning light, streaming through the hall's high windows, fell in similar waves across the gathered crowd. Halfdan rose slowly from his elder's seat. You think finding one hidden scroll gives you the right to overturn generations of tradition? No, Astrid stepped forward, her white dress now stained with cave dust and sea spray, transformed like everything else. But experiencing the truth of those traditions does. The challenge shield doesn't just record combat, it records choices, moments when the village faced the need for change. Her grandmother moved through the crowd to stand beside her, bringing her weaving shuttle, now revealed as another ancient tool of truth-telling, its patterns matching those on shield and scroll and horn. "The patterns remember," the old woman announced. "In wood, in bronze, in cloth, in stone. They remember what the traditions were meant to be, what we turned them into out of fear, and what they could become again through courage." Bjorn lifted the challenge shield, its weight familiar yet different from any weapon he'd held before. "I challenge not just the elders' authority, but the lies we've all lived by, the comfortable chains we've forged for ourselves." The shield caught the light, throwing wave patterns across the hall's walls. They merged with the scroll's glowing text and the horn's gleaming surface, creating a story that could no longer be ignored or denied. "If you want blood combat," one of the younger council members sneered, "then face me, Berserker. Prove your right to speak with steel." "No," Bjorn's voice was quiet, but carried like thunder. "I've spent 5 years learning a better way. The challenge shield shows us all our reflections, not just who we are, but who we could become." He held the shield up higher, and in its polished surface, the gathered villagers could see themselves transformed. Not just their physical reflections, but deeper truths. The warrior who longed to lay down his weapons, the mother who wanted her daughter to grow free of ancient fears, the elder who carried the weight of inherited lies. "The true challenge," Astrid declared, "is not between individuals, but within each of us. The choice to remain bound by comfortable chains, or to dive deep into transformation's waters." The shield's patterns began to move like waves, responding to the truth in her words. The horn in her other hand hummed with sympathetic resonance, and the scroll's text glowed brighter, as if all the ancient tools of truth were awakening together. Halfdan stepped forward, his staff trembling in his grasp. "And if we refuse this challenge, if we choose to keep to the old ways, then you choose to face the storms alone," Bjorn answered, compassion rather than condemnation in his voice. "The sea god's pressure for truth grows stronger with each denied transformation. Each chain we maintain becomes a weight, pulling us deeper into shadow." The challenge shield's surface rippled like troubled waters, reflecting not just the present moment, but possible futures. A village growing stronger through partnership with the sea, or one slowly drowning in its own denied truths. "It's not too late," Astrid added, seeing the fear and hope warring on faces around them. "The challenge shield shows us that each generation faces this choice anew. Each has the chance to break chains, to transform, to choose differently." The morning light strengthened, wave patterns dancing across shield and faces alike. In that illumination, the village stood poised between old lies and new truths, between comfortable chains and challenging freedom, and in the shield's reflecting surface they all saw it, not just what they had been, but what they might become. Not through combat or sacrifice, but through the courage to face transformation's deep waters and emerge changed. The storm spear stood upright in the ritual rocks, its ancient shaft marked with runes of power and partnership, not dominion, as generations had misread them. The morning tide swirled around its base as the village gathered for what they all knew would be their final confrontation with truth. "Our ancestors didn't use this to command the sea," Bjorn explained, his hand hovering over the spear's worn surface. "They used it to learn from it, to dive deep into wisdom's waters and return transformed." The crowd had followed them to the rocks, where, hours earlier, Astrid had stood bound for sacrifice. Now the broken chains lay scattered like shed snakeskins, while the tools of truth, horn, scroll, shield, and spear, stood arranged in a pattern that matched the cave painting's ancient wisdom. But not everyone was ready to embrace transformation. A group of warriors, led by Halfdan's son, stood with weapons drawn. "You speak of change," the young man challenged, "but what of the storms that drove us to sacrifice? What of the empty nets and hungry children?" "Look again at those storms," Astrid replied, stepping forward, "not with fear's eyes, but with Truths. She lifted the horn, its surface catching the morning light. Listen to what they're really telling us. The note she sounded wasn't the traditional sacrificial dirge, but something older and deeper. A call not to appease, but to understand. The waves responded, their patterns shifting to match the runes on the storm spear. The sea god never demanded death, her grandmother added, her weaving shuttle moving in harmony with the waves. It demanded growth, partnership, the courage to dive deep and emerge, changed. But fear and tradition had deep roots. One of the warriors lunged forward, blade swinging toward the scroll in Bjorn's hands, as if destroying the written truth could preserve comfortable lies. What happened? Next stunned everyone, most of all Bjorn himself. The battle rage he'd feared and suppressed for 5 years rose up, but transformed. Instead of blood fury, he felt something deeper, the strength not to destroy, but to protect, not to kill, but to illuminate. He caught the blade with the challenge shield, and where metal met ancient wood, truth light flared. The warrior stumbled back, his reflection in the shield's surface showing not just who he was, but who he could become. Your rage can transform too, Bjorn told him quietly, as mine did, as all things must. The storm spear thrummed with power. As the tide rose higher, this was the moment it had been crafted for, not to command the sea, but to learn from it, to show how every wave could teach about adaptation, about flowing around obstacles rather than shattering against them. Astrid moved to stand beside Bjorn, the horn ready to sound again. The true battle isn't between us, she declared. It's between what we've been and what we could be, between the chains we know and the freedom we fear. The morning light strengthened, catching bronze and wood and steel, transformed them all into mirrors of possibility. In the challenge shield's surface, the gathered villagers saw themselves as they could be, not victims of ancient hunger, but partners in eternal change. Halfdan's son raised his weapon one last time, but his hands shook. And if we refuse, if we choose to keep our chains, then you choose to face the storms alone, Bjorn replied, while we dive deep into transformation's waters and learn to swim with its currents. The storm spear's runes blazed suddenly, responding to truth spoken clear and clean. The sea itself seemed to pause, waiting for the village's choice. In that moment of decision, the weapons lowered one by one, not in defeat, but in recognition. The warriors looked at their blades and saw not tools of combat, but possibilities for transformation, like a berserker's rage reshaped into protecting truth, or a sacrifice's chains reformed into bonds of partnership. The tide reached its height, not threatening now, but inviting. The storm spear showed them how to read its patterns, how to dive deep, not in sacrifice, but in seeking wisdom. The challenge shield reflected not just their faces, but their potential, while the horn's note carried not death but awakening across the waters. And there on the ritual rocks, where generations of fear had fed ancient lies, transformation finally bloomed, not through combat or sacrifice, but through the courage to face truth's deep waters and emerge changed. The sea god's true face showed itself at last in the morning tide. Not a force of hunger to be appeased, but a partner in eternal transformation, waiting all these years for its people to remember how to swim in wisdom's depths and rise again. Renewed, the new village charter took shape under careful hands, its parchment fresh, but its wisdom ancient. Astrid's grandmother supervised its creation, her weaving patterns serving as guide for the new text that would bind their community not through fear, but through shared transformation. Each section must flow into the next, she instructed, like waves building upon waves, each truth supporting another. Her shuttle moved in rhythm with the scribe's pen, ensuring that even the charter's structure reflected their new understanding. The great hall had been transformed in the days following. Their confrontation at the ritual rocks. Where the sacrifice stone had stood, they now placed the challenge shield, its surface reflecting not just faces, but possibilities. The storm spear and sacred horn flanked it, no longer tools of domination, but reminders of partnership with the seas eternal change. Bjorn stood by the hall's open doors, watching fishing boats return with full nets. Since they had embraced the true meaning of their traditions, the sea had responded with abundance. Not because they had appeased it, but because they had finally learned to read its patterns, to work with its tides rather than against them. The old fears still surface sometimes, he admitted as Astrid joined him, like the battle rage, not gone, but transformed. Now, when I feel it rise, it comes as strength to protect, to build, to change. She took his hand, feeling the calluses earned not from wielding weapons, but from forging tools of creation. That's what the Charter means by honored transformation, not the absence of darkness, but its reshaping into light. Behind them, her grandmother called for their attention. The Charter's first draft was complete, its ink drying in patterns that echoed the cave painting's ancient wisdom. Each article affirmed their commitment to growth over stagnation, to partnership over dominion, to the courage of diving deep into change's waters. Where the old laws had demanded sacrifice, the new charter promised opportunity for transformation. Where tradition had bound, these words would guide. Even the section about leadership spoke not of ruling, but of navigating, of helping others find their way through wisdom's depths. "It needs your marks," the old woman said, holding out the pen. "Both of you, not as berserker and sacrifice, but as those who first dared to break the chains of custom and swim in deeper truths." They signed together, their names flowing into each other like tide meeting shore. And in that moment, watching the ink dry, they felt the rightness of all that had led them here. Every choice, every step, every transformation embraced rather than feared. The Charter would be their legacy, yes, but the real change was already living in the village around them, in warriors learning to protect wisdom rather than enforce tradition, in children being taught to swim in understanding's depths, in elders discovering that leadership meant growing alongside those they guided. Outside, the eternal sea continued its dance of transformation, each wave writing and rewriting the story of what they had been and what they were becoming. And in its depths, the true face of their god smiled at last, pleased not with sacrifice, but with the courage to change, to learn, to grow beyond the comfortable chains of fear into the endless possibilities of transformation. The Union bracelet caught the evening light as Astrid fastened it around Bjorn's wrist, its intricate metalwork showing waves and transformation spirals. He had forged matching pairs for them both, incorporating metal from the broken chains that had once bound sacrifices to the ritual rocks. What had once imprisoned, now connected, transformed by understanding and choice. "From chains to changes," she said softly, repeating the words inscribed on the bracelet's inner surface. Bjorn's hands, still bearing the marks of forge and battle, but now gentled by wisdom, secured her matching bracelet in return. The ceremony took place where the sacrifice stone had stood, but the space had been transformed. Now a circular pattern of runes decorated the floor, telling the true story of their people's relationship with the sea, not one of submission and sacrifice, but of partnership and perpetual growth. The village gathered around them, not as fearful witnesses to sacrifice, but as participants in transformation. Young warriors who had once trained for battle now learned the deeper strength of protecting wisdom. Children who had grown up dreading the sacrifice lottery now played in the waves, learning to read the sea's patterns as their ancestors had. Astrid's grandmother presided over the ceremony, her weaving shuttle moving in time with the waves visible through the great hall's open doors. The patterns she wove now were teaching tools, showing future generations how to dive deep into understanding's waters and emerge transformed. "The old ways serve us still," she pronounced, "but now we see them truly, not as chains to bind us, but as currents to guide us, not as demands for death, but as invitations to growth." The Union bracelets gleamed as Bjorn and Astrid raised their joined hands. Where once a berserker's rage had demanded silence and a sacrifice's submission had seemed inevitable, now stood two people who had chosen to dive deep into transformation's waters together. The sea god's voice carried in the evening tide, not hungry now, but harmonious. And in its eternal song, the village heard not demands for sacrifice, but invitations to endless transformation. Not the rattling of chains, but the music of waves, reshaping all they touched. The bracelets caught the last light of day, their spirals, promising not endings, but eternal beginnings. Not separation, but connection. Not sacrifice, but perpetual transformation. And in their gleam, the future wrote itself in patterns of possibility, each wave of change, building upon the last in endless, beautiful renewal. The dawn bell rang across Storm's Keep with a new voice, its bronze recast from the same metal as the ancient horn. No longer a warning of sacrifice, but a celebration of renewal. Each morning, its song reminded the village of their choice to embrace transformation rather than fear it. From their home near the forge, Bjorn and Astrid could see the fishing fleet setting out, sails painted with the same spiral patterns that had guided them in the Cave of Secrets. The boats moved with the waves now instead of fighting them, their crews reading the sea's wisdom rather than dreading its hunger. Below the ritual rocks, children played in the tide pools, learning the old stories in their true form. Their laughter carried on the wind as they discovered again and again how the sea could teach those willing to listen. Some wore small versions of the union bracelets, not as bindings, but as reminders that even the youngest could choose transformation over tradition when wisdom called. The bell's song merged with the wave's eternal voice, and in their harmony, the village heard its future, not a story of sacrifice and submission, but an endless journey of growth and change, each tide bringing new opportunities to dive deep into wisdom's waters and emerge transformed. The memorial stone rose from the transformed ritual rocks, not as a record of sacrifices, but as a testament to change. Its surface bore the names of all who had been lost to the old ways, but around each name, new runes spiraled, symbols of transformation and renewal, promising that their sacrifices had finally brought wisdom instead of temporary peace. Astrid's grandmother's final weaving hung beside it, showing the pattern of their people's journey from fear to understanding. In its threads, the story lived. A berserker who chose to break his silence, a sacrifice who dared to question tradition, and a village that found the courage to dive deep into transformation's waters. Years had passed since that storm-racked dawn, when chains had crumbled and truth had risen from the depths. Now, as evening light caught the waves, Bjorn and Astrid stood with their own daughter beside the memorial. She wore both the dawn bells, symbol and the union bracelet spirals, marking her not as a potential sacrifice, but as an heir to wisdom's endless tide. "The sea god still speaks," she said, reading the patterns in the waves as naturally as breathing, "not of hunger now, but of change." "And we answer," Bjorn replied, his voice carrying the strength of transformed rage, "not with fear, but with understanding." The eternal tide rolled in, each wave writing and rewriting their story of transformation, while above, the memorial stone stood as witness to what they had become, not victims of tradition, but partners in endless change.